This is the Zeppin Axis 120 Pro slider. This has 47-inch rails, a pan and tilt head, and can be used manually or with the controls on the back of the unit or on the Bluetooth app. There are 3 different sliders. There are the 80, 100, and the 120 that I have here. And the Pro option is the one that includes this pan and tilt head. Let's get into some specs, tests, and I'll give you my opinion of this slider at the end. Zeppin did send me this slider to review, however they don't get to see the video before it goes live, and all these words are my own. Powering options for the Zeppin Axis are one area that I like what they did here. You can power it from a USB-C power bank or wall outlet via USB-C, or you can use the Sony NP-F batteries. There are no internal batteries on the slider head or the tilt axis motors. For stability, this slider has feet that you can flip out, and as long as you have a level surface, that will work just fine. However, most of the time I don't have enough room to put a slider on a table, especially if I'm doing like a macro shot and the product is also on the table. So to get the angle I would want, I needed to use some tripods and some other support. I tried fixed tripods and rolling stands, and they all had their drawbacks until I found this video tripod. And the reason why this tripod is so nice is because it has an expanding center column that with one twist you can lower and raise the center column. Piggybacking off of the previous is having a ball head that you can loosen the bottom of this tripod, and the ball head actually moves around, so you don't have to try to level with the legs. You can get the height you want and then level the entire slider with the ball head. That was very important, especially if you're using this tripod outside. There's never a level surface when you need one, and if you want to get a perfectly level slide, there is a level on the back of the slider, but getting it level with a tripod outdoors in the middle of a shoot could be a little nerve-wracking. And if you don't have the proper equipment to stabilize the slider, you're not going to get the best results. So I found that investing in 2 tripods, and I'll leave this one linked in the description, will make your life a lot easier when it comes to quickly setting this up and getting the best results. Zeppin does include some support legs if you want to use this slider with 1 tripod in the middle, but honestly, I wouldn't recommend doing that with the 120. You might be able to get away with that with the 80, but the 120 is just too long unless you're using a phone. You're going to see a little bit of shake once your slider and camera gets to one end or the other. So for the most stable results, I would recommend using 2 tripods with the 120. When it comes to using this slider, I mostly used this with A and B points. Pressed play and let the slider just play back and forth. It's pretty simple, so let's set up a very quick slide. First, we'll power the slider on and clear the A and B points in the menu. Doing this each time will avoid any strange drifting in case you have any A and B points already set. Then move the slider to the first point, press the A button, move to the second point, press the B button. Once you start a slide on A, the slider will go till B and stop. Pressing the loop button and trying to start the slide again will sometimes cause the slider to not remember the points and drift off course. This seems like it could be fixed with a firmware update, but as long as you press the loop button before starting the slide, everything works as intended. 2 more things to know about the slides. Even if you're in the app, there's no way to pause between waypoints once you start the slide. And there's no way to adjust the smoothing from the start or the end of the slide. The slider automatically handles all of those for you. I wanted to test a few different ways to use the slider before bringing this out on an actual client shoot to see how it performs. So here are some of my go-to slider tests. First off, how smooth are the macro capabilities? You'll get your most usable clips in the middle of the slides in my testing. For this reason, I think the longest slider is actually the best option if you're going to be using this for macro shots. The beginning and end are a little bit shaky when the motor stops at the end and starts back up in the beginning. The beginning and ending shakes are less noticeable when you're sliding under 10% speed. For interviews, I found this to be okay, but for product shots or something that I want to shoot in real time a little faster, the beginning and ending does have a little bit of shake to it. The next test was to see if the slider can repeat slides over and over. This slider can get very close, but it struggles to perfectly repeat things on a loop. The next clip probably will make you dizzy, but watch the whole thing. Here is an overlay at 3 shots of the same speed. Those were looping with the same camera settings, and you can see they line up for a short period of time in the center of the slide. However, they're just a little bit off in the beginning and ending. If you plan to do a slide where you're going to clone yourself 3 or 4 times in different frames, you may have to adjust the clip speed 5 or 10% in post to account for that change in speed in the beginning and the end of your slide. It's not perfect, but it can be done. The next test was noise. We're now sliding at 100% speed on the Zeppin Axis. Let's see if we can hear it in the microphone. We are now sliding at 50% speed with the Zeppin Axis 120, and somehow 50% is louder than 100%. Let's see if we can listen to it on this Sennheiser MKH416. Now we're at 15% on the Zeppin Axis, and to my ear, I can't really hear this, but let's give a listen and see if our microphone is picking it up. Now we're at 5% speed on the slider. Looking at my levels, I don't see any movement when I'm not speaking, so let's take a listen. I found that anything over 20% will produce an audible noise, and 1 to 10% speed is almost silent. 11 to 19, you can hear a slight noise if you're near the slider, but from 20% and faster, you can hear the slider in a quiet room. For filming an interview, I would probably set this to 5% anyways, but if you need fast slides during an interview for some reason, make sure to place your microphone very far away from the slider and potentially maybe even have to denoise some of that in post. I thought of this next test after I was trying to figure out how to get the most smooth slides possible. I thought maybe the tilt head would be responsible for some of those shakes at the beginning and ends of the slides. So I set up some test slides without the tilt head at all, with a ball head and with my camera mounted directly onto the slider. I was surprised that the tilt motor didn't affect the slide stability at the beginning or ending of the slides. Unless your camera was really out of balance on this quick release plate, then your camera will kind of like drift in the middle of the entire slide. There is no way to tell if your slider is in balance or out of balance. So I guess if it's out of balance, you will know immediately. But if your slide is doing some weird things along the way, maybe try to unloosen your slider and adjust it on this axis. Like I said, an interesting part of the slider is the fact that you don't have any balance or tuning options or calibration options. The slider takes care of all that for you, which is nice, but it is easy to overload the motors, especially if you have a larger camera with like a V-mount battery in the back of it and a smaller lens on front. I could see that being very hard to effectively tilt the camera if you can't actually tell when your camera is in balance on this plate. So I think having a notification similar to like what gimbals have, I think having that kind of a notification either on the app or the back of the screen on the slider would be a great addition to help get the smoothest slides you can possibly get. An interesting part of the slider is that you can release it from the belt and use it manually. If you're going to do this, you probably want to supply your own, you can see how level my desk is. If you're doing this, you probably want to supply your own fluid head of some kind. Like if your camera's on a tripod, you can probably just take the head of the tripod off and put it on the slider, get any shots you need, and then put your head back on the tripod if you want to just quickly knock out your slider shots. I thought that was a very interesting part of the Axis. Another thing to note about this slider, this is one that you want to make sure is up to date on the latest firmware you can possibly get. When I first got this out of the box, my A and B points weren't working the way I thought A and B points should work. There was a lot of drift in between for some reason. However, when I updated my firmware, that problem seemed to go away. Another thing, I reached out to Zeppin on Instagram and said, hey, I think this is actually making more noise than it should be for a slider that I would use at an interview in a quiet environment. So they said, oh, check the firmware update. So I downloaded the new firmware again, and it seemed like under 20% was quieter and under 10% was noticeably quieter, which brings me to the price of the Axis slider. In this configuration, this costs about $1,000 US, and that is a lot of money. but comparing that to other sliders on the market, like the Rhino slider, which I also own, it is a fraction of the price of that slider. The Rhino Arc 2 with the 24-inch rails costs about $2,300, and the Ultimate Bundle that I have costs about $3,600. When you compare that to the price of the Axis slider in this configuration, this is a much more affordable and approachable price point for a lot of filmmakers. If you're using smaller setups like mirrorless cameras or stripped down cinema cameras or even phones, this is a great value as long as you're okay with your slides being a little jittery at the ends and the noise being an issue when you're over 20% speed. What do you guys think of the Axis slider? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you guys for sticking around to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.